G'day YouTube, how the heck are we doing? It is Foul Play here, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be taking a look through my Bogles sideboard toolkit. So if you're anything like me, you've been playing a deck for a long time, you might have your casual sort of 60 or 75 including the sideboard, and then you'll develop a toolkit over time. But this compounds over many years, many years of being a Bogle player. We've actually got 3 decks, one for each of the format, and then most importantly what we're all here for, a heck of a lot of sideboard cards as part of a toolkit. So today we're going to take a look specifically at the sideboard cards across the various formats and all the toolkit and wacky stuff that I've collected throughout the years to solve various problems. Alright, so let's start things off with perhaps one of the most interesting deck ideas that I've ever had. And perhaps one of the most successful ideas as well. So that is a Bant Bogles rocking the playset of Force of Negation. So obviously this was briefly after Modern Horizons 1 had came out. The metagame was significantly less powerful then than what it is currently. Sort of most of the unfair combo decks did the unfair stuff during their own turn. So Bogles is, for the most part, a combo deck. It's also a tempo deck. We want to be utilizing all our mana that we can during each of our turns. And realistically, trying to hold up interaction for our opponents isn't always viable. But thanks to Force of Negation, we're able to tap out during our turn, hold up a counterspell for your opponent's Khan the Great Creator, various other cards. We had Upsal Spells running about, which is absolutely devastating. Also Dredge, Amulet Titan, going off with the Summoner's Pact, even just the Amulet of Vigor. Lots of really massive targets for that one. Alright, so a couple of basic lands in there. Also some other forms of land, obviously, too. Main deck wise, there's not a huge amount of interesting cards there outside of the normal modern suite, until we get to blue. So Staggering Insight is a very interesting one. I'll just clear some of those other cards out the way. So Staggering Insight, I thought I had very large hopes for this when it came out. I think it was very good at the time, but over time it's become sort of worse and worse. For 2 mana, only adding 1 power and toughness to your creature really isn't good enough. It does give lifelink, and it does give, when this creature deals damage to a player, combat damage to a player, draw a card. That's all well and good. Realistically, I think Curious Obsession is better, and possibly Curious Obsession isn't even good enough for Modern at the moment, unfortunately. But this was really sweet when it came out. Perhaps if this had an extra bit of text on it, like it was uncounterable or gave 2/2, it would be more of a consideration, but unfortunately that is not the case. Alright, so continuing on from there, we have Invisible Stalker. So Invisible Stalker is sort of the third Bogle, sitting there at, well, I guess it's technically the 4th Bogle. There's still Harnell Edgewalker as well, but sitting there at 2 mana, 1/1 hexproof and unblockable. So unblockable is fantastic in the deck, particularly if you're pairing it with your Staggering Insight, your Curious Obsessions. You're getting that card draw. Your opponent can't do anything about it. This was also a time when Skyclave Apparition was running about, Flicker Wisp. There were lots of instant speed antics coming about from Hate Bears decks, and that wasn't always the easiest to deal with. Okay, so now we have Arcane Flight, 1/1 flying. I mean, it's okay. It's pretty bare bones for the mana. For the color wheel, it gives 1/1 flying for 1 mana. You can't really ask too much more. Unfortunately, flying's not that good these days. Not as good as it was. Complete evasion from creatures is better because there's a lot of Is It Murktide? There's lots of like Ledger Shredders. there's a lot of flying in Modern currently. It's not a good evasive term really, but if you need to block, obviously that is a viable option. All right, so continuing on from there, Curious Obsession, which we spoke about before. Maybe we're going to see more of this in the future. Realistically, while the elementals are still running rampant, Force of Negation isn't really going to be super worthwhile. And given that, probably Curious Obsession might be a little bit subpar as well. All right, so looking at more sideboard cards in the color pie, I mean, Tecatli is not like hugely interesting, but this was just with this pile of cards, so that's what we're going with. So creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger, sort of like Torpor Orb in a way, 1/3. So any like 1/1 aura on it would get it out of lightning bolt range, which was semi-relevant. Obviously there's Hushbringer, the 2/1 flyer, but that's a little bit harder to get out of lightning bolt range. Again, not hugely relevant these days because Unholy Heat is a thing. A card that was really, really sweet at the time though, Teferi Time Raveler. So there was a big issue, and there still is a big issue with Khan the Great Creator decks. Being able to tutor up that main deck Ensnaring Bridge, or that sideboard Ensnaring Bridge into their hand, play it, and then you just do nothing for the rest of the game. This has probably been superseded, a little bit by Beside You, which you can main deck, and we do main deck, and it's a very, very good card. But Teferi Time Raveler at the time, if you were splashing into blue, gave you sort of a main deckable card. If you ever resolve it, your opponent can't counter any of your auras afterwards unless they deal with the Teferi, which is kind of nice. And you could even do some tricky stuff like bounce your own aura, replay it with the Core Spirit Dancer, and then you'd get like 2 lots of card draw off it, one off the Teferi, one off the Core Spirit Dancer, and that all was like pretty damn sweet. The good old faithful Gadok Teague, you can see this original print in the Lauren. We all know how fantastic Gadok Teague is. We're still playing it. It's still a beautiful card. I've got some spicier Teagues than that later on too. And last but not least, in this blue deck, we have Slip out the back as well. Obviously, this was a more recent edition, but I love this card so much. I had to pick up some copies in foil. Instant speed, 1 blue mana, put a 1/1 counter on target creature, it phases out. So you can use this to dodge like a Blast Zone, sacrifice a creature effect, such as from Archon of Cruelty or Liliana of the Veil. And the really sweet thing about it, because of how phasing out works, is you actually get to keep all the auras that are on your creature. All right, so this next trip down memory lane is going to be a bit more of a recent one, but I'm sure you all remember the absolute medlem that was Throne of Eldraine. We had like Oko Thief of Crowns come out. Around that same time, we also had Companions. We had Lurrus of the Dream Den. And one really, really sweet card, which I absolutely loved, was Once Upon a Time. So this was really good. If you had you have 8 hexproof creatures in the deck, you could potentially choose to replace Core Spirit Dancer with Once Upon a Time, depending on how prevalent removal was. And this would allow you to look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or land card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So obviously you got to play this for free as well. If it was the first spell you've cast in the game, you can play it without its mana cost. Afterwards, not super great. So the thing I loved about this was it increased the consistency of the deck, realistically, in my opinion. If you didn't have a creature in your hand, you had a fairly high fetch land count, like 6 to 8 fetch lands. You're talking about 8 creatures, 6 to 8 fetch lands, 14 to 16 cards. You're digging through quite a lot of your deck, looking for a potential extra creature if you're happy with the hand otherwise. Outside of that, if you've already got your creature, it gives you that ability to either search up a second creature to play around Liliana of the Veil, or you can fix your mana. It's great. You can get a land. You can guarantee that second land drop, and you can fix a lot of the issues that the deck had. So this was fantastic. Unfortunately, I never ended up purchasing a Lurrus. I was close once, and the seller mucked me around, and eventually I got a refund. But I don't actually own Lurrus, sadly enough. Once upon a time, I sort of got at the beginning of Pioneer's inception, and that was like really sweet because the Pioneer deck only had still only has access to Glade Cover Scout as far as the hexproof wheel is concerned. It also potentially had like Basara Archer Tower, and Once Upon a Time just gave you that extra consistency. In addition to that, the mana was pretty poor in Pioneer, like color fixing, things like that. It's a lot better these days. The deck's a lot more successful and consistent these days, but Once Upon a Time's been banned. Unfortunately, with this card, much like Lurrus, other decks utilize this card way better than we did. The biggest deck that comes to mind obviously being Amulet Titan. All right, so we see Gadok Teague here, the box topper promo. I remember when this came out, I was super excited. I think that's Ultimate Masters box topper promo. I just think it looks really sweet with the extended border, and yeah, much love for this card. I did pick up a playset. I'm not sure where I've put all of them specifically, but here's one, and it's really cool, and I hope you appreciate that being in my collection. All right, continuing on from there, and sweet cards. So Collector Roof, another monster from Modern Masters. Unfortunately not super relevant these days, but basically Stony Silence on a sick. Activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. So it shuts down things like Ratchet Bomb, things like Expedition Map, Oblivion Stone, etc. Engineered Explosives. I mean, it's just a great card. If your opponent's boarding out removal against you as well, which was sometimes the general consensus, especially when removal was less diverse, like it had to target a creature. It couldn't be like Assassin Trophy, target a creature, or any other permanent. Cards like this were a lot more valuable. All right, so continuing on from there, we also have a couple of odd inclusions, which I didn't really utilize too much, but they were good to have in your toolbox. So if you're expecting a lot of red, maybe cards like Pyroclasm as well, which sweep the board, Anger of the Gods, you could potentially look at a Core Firewalker. Also, it's just a really sweet card to board in against Burn, because then all of a sudden all their burn spells start gaining you life, and it basically shrinks the power of their burn spells. And Auriok Champion, which may be more of a card that could have been considered to have been boarded in against like a Death Shadow deck, where they've got Fatal Push, they've got Lightning Bolt, and maybe even Drowning Lock, and Auriok Champion just dodges all forms of their removal. Obviously, with the triggered ability of whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may gain 1 life. Potential even more synergy with that with Cartouche of Solidarity. So, like, some pretty sweet creatures in the toolbox there, and we got some more coming. Next up is Ethersworn Canonist. So each player has cast a non-artifact spell this turn, can't cast additional non-artifact spells. So this was primarily played by the Affinity decks. Whenever they were versing a combo deck, probably the most notorious of which at the time was Ad Nauseam. So that was a combo deck which would draw its own library, float some mana with some Simian Spirit Guides, filter that mana into any relevant colors that it might need with Monomorphos, and eventually it would play like a Laboratory Maniac, or more recently a Thassa's Oracle, and combo off and win the game on the spot. Something like Ethersworn Canonist, very good there. Also, maybe potentially would delay like an Ups or Spells deck a little bit as well. So Geist of St. Traft when we're in Bant as well. It's just a 3-mana hexproof creature, so I guess it's like the 5th hexproof creature. If you ever end up resolving this against control after they've just wiped the board with a Supreme Verdict, it's going to be pretty hard for them to deal with, and it's 6 damage a turn as well, so it's a pretty pressing clock. Unfortunately, with how long the blue deck was viable, I didn't get to run Geist of St. Traft as much as I would have hoped. So the next card, which is really sweet, moving away from the creature hate, and really interesting one, Open the Armory. So for 2 mana, it's a sorcery. You may search your library for an aura or equipment card, reveal it, then put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So particularly when we didn't have as many options in as far as auras were concerned, this allowed you to like potentially run a bit of a toolbox deck. And that would take away from a little bit of the explosiveness. Obviously, if you're searching up Ethereal Armor, you're just going for maximum damage. It's like a 3-mana Ethereal Armor, which is a little bit worse than, for example, all the glitters. But it had that versatility, and I did experiment with it for a while, but mostly it wasn't amazing. Probably the most interesting thing that I found during my many dives on Gatherer was Quiet Disrepair, which really paired quite nicely with Open the Armory. So Quiet Disrepair, 2-mana enchantment. Enchant artifact or enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you choose 1, destroy enchant permanent, or you gain 2 life. So it was sort of artifact and enchantment hate, and also life gains. So maybe it could be good against burn, kind of, but again, similar to the problem with Open the Armory, it's just too slow. Additional to the combination costing 4 mana, it doesn't trigger until the beginning of your upkeep. So your opponent's got a whole turn to either ignore it or answer it, which wasn't always the best, but it was definitely like an interesting thought process nonetheless. All right, continuing on with the creature train now. Melira Outcast. Now, this was a card mostly played by the Birthing Pod decks back in the day, but when Infect was pretty large, and also Infect didn't have access to very good removal, I mean, realistically, they still don't. It's pretty much just Dismember, but one of Melira in the sideboard that you could potentially play on turn 2 and just completely nerf the absolute misery out of your opponent's infect creatures. It was a really powerful idea, and I think if Infect rises a little bit, maybe even that Infect Storm deck, the green-red Storm deck, rises up in popularity, Melira could definitely see some play again. It's just like 2 mana, slam this down, do you have the answer? If not, your opponent has to do twice the work to kill you. All right, so continuing on, we've got some Hushwing Griffs. So this was much like the Tocatli Honor Guard that we saw before, but instead of it being a 2-mana creature, it's a 3-mana creature with flash and flying. Obviously a bit of a smaller body on it as well, being a 2/1, bit easier for your opponent to kill. Renin 6 loves this guy, but it was just, again, an interesting card to keep in your toolbox, ready for when you need it. So Aven Mind Sensor was a card I kept around. I mean, unfortunately, it is 3 mana, and holding up 3 mana for a Bogles deck is quite a lot, but the ideas are still there. If an opponent would search their library, that player searches the top 4 cards of their library instead, mostly played by Hate Bear decks, up until they got more powerful replacements for it. But the interesting thing about this is if your opponent, like you're versing Amulet Titan, and they play a Summoner's Pact, flash in Aven Mind Sensor in response, suddenly they're like, oh crap, I could realistically whiff on this one. All right, and continuing on from the ETB ones, obviously we got Torpor Orb here, so these are some foil Torpor Orbs from way back in the day, back in Phyraxia, and I mean, they're pretty sweet, they're pretty fantastic. Obviously, Torpor Orb has a little bit more relevance as well if you're expecting your opponent to keep in creature removal. So if if you want a replacement situationally for your Hushbringers, maybe consider a Torpor Orb, particularly if they're cheap at that point in time as well. All right, here's our superstar, Boseiju Who Endures, takes up a land slot. It's that answer to Ensnaring Bridge decks. We finally have it. Thank you, Neon Dynasty, or Kawagama, or whatever it was. A really fantastic card. I just hate the fact that, again, other decks will utilize this card better than we do. They have a Renin 6, they have a Boseiju. Not too happy times for us ahead. All right, so Artifact and Enchantment. Hey, and boy, have we got a plethora of cards here for you today. So initially there were probably two main contenders for this slot. We had Nature's Claim, which was a 1-mana instant, destroy target artifact or enchantment its controller gains 4 life. And we had Seal of Primordium, a 2-mana enchantment that stays on the battlefield with the activated ability of destroy target artifact or enchantment. So both these cards had their pros and cons. Nature's Claim, you had to hold up the mana. It also had the pro of if you targeted your own enchantment, such as against a burn deck, you could actually get some life gain in response to a burn spell that would otherwise kill you, or shrink your creature in response to a deflecting palm. Seal of Primordium, as we talked about earlier on, Bogles likes to tap mana every turn. It likes to be mana efficient, and Seal of Primordium, you tap that 2 mana once. You don't have to hold up any combat tricks. You get to just get on with your game plan. Sure, your opponent knows what you're going to be doing, but in the meantime, you do get on with your game plan. All right. So continuing on from there, we got the printing of Natural State as well. So destroy target artifact or enchantment with mana value 3 or less. The upside to this is your opponent doesn't gain 4 life, so you can kill them a bit quicker. The downside obviously being that 3 CMC or less conditioning. All right, and continuing from there, Unravel the Ether. So this is an interesting one. It's a 2-mana spell. Choose target artifact or enchantment. Its owner shuffles it into his or her library. So the main reason why you'd be looking at playing this, there was also Deglamour, which had the same effect as well, which we see a lot in Pauper against the Ponza deck. But the main good thing about this is when you were like scared of Affinity, packing hate for Affinity, Affinity boards in its welding jars ready for that hate. And Unravel the Ether, instead of destroying it, will shuffle it into their library. So although it's still technically in their deck, they could still draw it. It deals with the problem while dodging that welding jar hate, which is pretty damn nifty. All right, Qasali Pridemage. This is a card which sporadically was in my toolkit, never really got too much play, but sort of a similar idea to the Seal of Primordium, where you put it on the battlefield. I guess you have to hold up the 1 mana, but in the meantime, you get that Exalted Trigger. If your opponent somehow dealt with the Hexproof creature, it's also a different creature you can enchant and start beating down with. All right, and we have got a host of this next card. I absolutely loved this card. Dromoka's Command. So Dromoka's Command was a really fantastic toolbox card. For 2 mana, you get to choose 2 of the potential effects at instant speed. Prevent all damage target instant or sorcery would deal this turn. It's pretty good against burn. Pretty extremely good against deflecting palm, which burn uses. Target player sacrifices an enchantment, so you can make your opponent sacrifice an enchantment, such as a worship, which like the humans decks did play for a while there. The spirits decks did play for a while there. Put a 1/1 counter on target creature, so you can grow your own creature, which is pretty good, and you can fight a creature an opponent controls. So you can grow your creature, fight an opponent, deal with an enchantment, fight an opponent. Just a very versatile card to have in your sideboard, and this is one that could potentially see play again in the future. Khans of Tarkir being the set where that one was printed, and that was all really, really sweet. So rounding up the enchantment interaction, the last one is Deicide, and I did play a fair bit of this back in the day. So exile target exile target enchantment. If the exiled card is a god card, search its opponent's search its controllers, graveyard, hand, library, and exile any number of cards with the same name. So particularly against Heliod combo, that's the reason why we're playing this deck, the one that goes for infinite life gain. And if you can remove all the Heliods from their deck, they can't combo for infinite life anymore. That's fantastic. And obviously they can't combo for damage with their walking ballistas either. So that was all really, really sweet enchantment hate. Let's move on to the artifact hate, and this video is turning into a long one, but I'll try and gloss through. So Sony Silence mostly played against Affinity back in the day, obviously as well, pretty good into Tron, much like Collector Rift, which we saw earlier. So Kataki War's Wage, all artifacts have at the beginning of your upkeep sacrifice this artifact unless you pay 1. It is a 2-mana 2/1 creature. And one of my viewers just reached out to me earlier on. Roland reached out to me earlier on, just last week, saying that he played this deck recently and completely blew a Hammer Time player out of the water. I mean, if they're not expecting it, it's fantastic. Most Hammer Time players will keep in much Father Worldly Light against you, so just be aware it might not keep around. It's also got that legendary typing, which could be awkward too. So continuing on with our hate of artifacts, we've got Creeping Corrosion, 4 mana, which is a little bit difficult to get to, but destroy all artifacts, pretty good. Particularly when games go long, and games definitely went long against a very particular Whir of Invention deck, which milled you out. That deck was called Lantern Control. It was really annoying, and the most specific hate card for Lantern Control was not Creeping Corrosion, but Consulate Crackdown. So that's a 5-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile all artifacts your opponents control until Consulate Crackdown leaves the battlefield. Perks of this: played around Welding Jar, which Creeping Corrosion didn't. Downside of this, it cost a mana extra, and you rarely got to cast this against a Lantern player unless it was in your opening hand. You dodged the Thoughtseize, things like that. They normally brought in things like Nature's Claim as well against you because you're Bogles. But it was really sweet tech at the time, and just definitely one to keep in mind. All right, so Deafening Silence. So this is hate for Storm type decks. It's at 1 mana. It's pretty sweet. I was playing this for a little while recently against the Living End deck, but unfortunately that made way for Chalice of the Void, because Chalice of the Void not only worked against Violent Outburst, but also against Shardless Agent, which is a creature. So obviously Shardless Agent plays the creature. They can then cast the Living End, because the Living End is the first non-creature spell of the turn. Chalice of the Void I do have somewhere. I was unable to find it for this video. Apologies for that, but I've got some foil Chalice somewhere as well, just not to be included on this one. So we're on to Graveyard Hate. We have got Rest in Peace, probably the be-all and end-all, the strongest one. Enters the battlefield, exiles all cards currently in graveyard, and then if any cards or tokens would be put into graveyard from anywhere instead, exile them instead. So it's a replacement effect as well, which is pretty sweet and very strong. From there, we had a host of other Graveyard Hate. Relic of Progenitors, which was a pretty popular one for a long time there. A 1-mana artifact where you can activate it, target player exiles a card from his or her graveyard. You could do sweet things like this against Mill. You could exile a Surgical Extraction target in your own graveyard, sort of obscure, but you could do it. And then for 1 mana, you can exile all cards from all graveyards, draw a card. So mostly this is like Dredge Hate, right? Soul Guard Lantern ran around a little bit during Lurrus days, and it had its day, but it's not a stronger effect as the other 2 cards. So a really sweet card, Grafdigger's Cage. 1 mana, creatures can't enter the battlefield from graveyards or library. Players can't cast cards from graveyards or library. So obviously good against Dredge, also good against decks like Arcane of Cruelty, or back in the day, the Gristlebrand deck that just ran amok, gaining life with Nourishing Shoal and all the other stuff. So sort of to do with graveyard hate as well, but more specifically mill hate. So Gaia's Blessing, a little bit of graveyard hate, a little bit slow. You play it, you can draw a card. When it's put in the graveyard from your library, shuffle your graveyard into your library, including Gaia's Blessing. Emrakul, much the same thing. Came out a little bit earlier, but was good mill tech because it does have that shuffle effect against mill. And if you get this trigger into the graveyard, even if your opponent's Surgical Extraction's one of these cards out of your graveyard in response, you're still resetting, like 20 to 40 cards back into your library, which is a big blow for that deck. Last bit of graveyard hate I've got here is Surgical Extraction. Certain combo decks store cards in their graveyard. You can Surgical Extraction in response. An extension of this is Fairy Macabre as well, which is also a 0 mana effect that can exile 2 cards in a graveyard. This one will just exile all copies from the library, so it's probably the more powerful effect mostly. All right, here we get on to a bit more obscure stuff, just briefly. So there was a time where I had some issues with John for a little while there, but Fist of Ironwood was an interesting one where, again, I was searching through Gatherer and it seemed like it could maybe be good at the time. This was like way before Cartouche of Solidarity days. Enters the battlefield, 2 mana aura, enters the battlefield, put 2 1/1 green sprawling tokens onto play. Enchant creature has trample, so it doesn't actually give any stats, which isn't very good, but it did give 2 1/1 sprawling tokens, and it also gave trample. I didn't really play this much, but I did pick it up because it was only a couple of cents. Alright, here's the wackier card that I picked up, guys, and I promise there is a good story behind this one. Matilda's Pride, 2 mana tribal enchantment with Kithkin typing. Whenever a non-token creature you control attacks, you may pay 1 white mana. If you do, put a 1/1 white Kithkin soldier creature token into play, tapped and attacking. So this might seem absolutely absurd to you, but there was a day after like Ataxian or Rivals of Ataxian or whatever it was called, there were 2 specific cards that blue-white control were playing that were an issue for us. The first of which was Settle the Wreckage, which was exile all attacking creatures are playing controls. The second was Blessed Alliance. So Settle the Wreckage was 4 mana, instant speed obviously, and at 2 mana instant speed they had Blessed Alliance, which made you sacrifice a singular creature that was tapped and attacking. I did pick up some Matilda's Pride for a little while there. I don't even think I ended up playing this card particularly, but it was a way to deal with that problem of if you're playing around one, you're playing into the other. Realistically, I just ended up keeping or boarding in Leyline of Sanctity instead, because both Blessed Alliance and Settle the Wreckage ended up targeting you. So that was just a bit of a convoluted card, but I did pull it out for a specific problem. All right, so now we're on to a bit of Storm hate, a bit of Tron hate. This saw a little bit of play. The obvious weakness is it's like 2 mana. It doesn't lock Storm off hard. It doesn't lock Tron off hard. It just makes it a little bit more difficult for them, but they can still get there in the end. Defense Grid, kept this in my toolbox because I was concerned about counter magic sort of thing. Players making me sacrifice creatures that are attacking, like a Celestial Flare, Blessed Alliance, things like that we went over just before. Realistically, this didn't see much play either. All right, a card I did play a fair bit of though, Heroic Intervention. This card is awesome. So it's a really good answer to Engineered Explosives, to Blast Zone, to Ratchet Bomb, and like Blast Zone was such a hassle for me for such a long time, and Heroic Intervention was really good. Like, obviously the downside is you have to hold up mana to play around it, but it was kind of a cool thing at the time. All right, here's a bit of a wacky, obscure one as well. Sort of played into ad nauseum a little bit. Worship. If you control a creature, damage it would reduce your life total less than 1. This is 1 instead. I mean, I guess that's not very good against ad nauseum, but against burn or something, it's pretty relevant if they haven't got that enchantment interaction that worship can put in a little bit of work. All right, Caracas. I love this card. I love this art, this extended art. And this was before players got that like fatigue with overprinting, with overpowered sets, things like that. This was like a very pleasant experience. This was picked up for Legacy Bogles. Obviously, it's not modern legal. I've tested Legacy Bogles. It's really bad, especially at the moment. But it's just a land which it takes up a land swap and you can disable an opponent's attacking creature, right? Okay. So here's some more funky stuff. 6 cents, similar to Keen Sense, got a little bit of play there for a while. We did muck around a little bit post Luris with Reduke List, which ran like a playset of Keen Sense or 6 cents. And they're just like pretty sweet cards that generate a lot of advantage. Realistically, this isn't aggressive enough these days. And if Curious Obsession isn't good enough, 6 cents, which doesn't even give a stat, is probably not good enough either. Luminarch Mantle, sort of like a card I had in my toolbox a little bit. For 2 mana, it gives 2/2. Most of our 2 mana auras only give like 1/1. I guess All That Glitters has potential to give a lot more. But this was like pre All That Glitters. And you could sacrifice it to give flying until end of turn, or sacrifice any permanent. You could sacrifice a land to give your creature flying until end of turn. So it's kind of like a cool card. Didn't see like a huge amount of play from me personally. But when you're looking for like toolbox auras, that definitely fits the build. All right, so people are going to be pretty damn hyped for this one. Mana Tithe. I did play Mana Tithe for a while there. Personally, I didn't love it. A lot of people will say that Mana Tithe was fantastic for them. Your opponents never expect it. There was the saying going around that it will get your opponents once, but it won't get them again. And converse to that, people were like, yeah, but it gets them more than once. So this is probably one of the most widely debated cards in Bogle history on whether or not it's being good or bad. Personally, I don't like it. I don't think an opponent having to pay 1 extra mana is really good enough, especially in this day and age. Maybe you could have got like a Liliana of the Veil with it back in the day if your opponent hasn't thought seized it out of your hand first. But that was like fairly unlikely. All right. So we are on to removal. Here's some little FNM promo Path to Exiles that we got. I didn't pay $3 for this one, although realistically it's probably worth less than that these days anyway. I think these were around like $20 when I was picking them up, but I was also picking them up for free at FNM's. This was our go-to removal spell for the longest time. The annoying thing about it these days, though, decks are very mana efficient. If you give your opponent an extra mana on turn 1 or turn 2 by answering, for example, a Ragavan, it's so detrimental to your game plan. But maybe against something like a Splinter Twin, this card actually had a fair bit of relevance, and it exiled as well, which is a lot better than putting creatures in the graveyard most of the time. All right, so wacky. The removal gets wackier and wackier. So Savage Swipe is actually really sweet, and I have a huge amount of love for this card because it is removal that shocks your opponent for 2 damage as well, essentially, because target creature you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Then if its power is 2, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If its power is 2, then it fights target creature you don't control. So the thing I like about this is you turn 1 a Glade Cover Scout, a Slippery Bogle. You turn 2 an Ethereal Armor. You Savage Swipe your opponent's Noble Hierarch. So when I was playing this card, Noble Hierarch was huge. And unlike Path to Exile, which gave your opponent a mana, this did not. And you got to deal 2 damage to them, which was a nice little interim. I did play this card a little bit to relative success as well. Maybe this is something we could look at playing again, because like Ragavan is pretty sweet, but this is a pretty funky card. Not as funky as our next contender though. That card is Gelid Shackles. So for 1 white mana, you can enchant a creature Enchant creature can't block and its activated abilities can't be played, or that would be errata to activated these days. If you activate a snowland, enchant creature gains defender until end of turn, so it disables its ability to attack too. So this might seem wacky, it might seem convoluted as removal, but there was a day where this horrible card was everywhere, and that card was Spellskite. So Spellskite is 2 mana artifact, and you could pay 2 life to redirect target spell or ability to Spellskite. So what your opponents would end up doing would be targeting your own enchantments onto their Spellskite and disabling you. Get a little bit of play around against Spellskite with cards like Daybreak Coronet, because they have to target a creature with an enchantment on them. So even if your opponent pays the 2 life, the ability just sort of fizzles and you can still get them taking the damage. Cards like Cartouche of Solidarity, Cetessan Training have to target creatures you control as well. So that's like sort of another workaround to Spellskite in a now day and age. All right, so the last bit of removal I've got in the toolbox here is On Thin Ice. Enchant a snowland you control when On Thin Ice enters the battlefield. Exile a creature an opponent controls until On Thin Ice leaves the battlefield. So this is pretty sweet. It's an enchantment which sticks on the battlefield. It has to enchant a snowland if you've got, you know, a decent number of fetches in your deck, 6 to 8. That's fairly achievable in most games, particularly with Core Spirit Dancer drawing you more cards. The obvious strength of this is it has good synergy with Ethereal Armor. The obvious disadvantage to this is it has like your opponent's brought in enchantment hate against you. This is an enchantment. So it sort of has that disynergy post board, but main board, I guess it's a viable option. It also doesn't give your opponent a mana like Path to Exile does. Alright, so some funkier stuff here. Pithing Needle, I mean, I played this many times over the years. I played it into Heliod, naming like Devoted Druid so they can't untap their mana. I've played it into like Blast Zone decks, Engineered Explosives deck, Liliana of the Veil decks against Jund. This card's seen so much play from me. It's really versatile, and it's something we can even consider keeping in these days. You could name Beseiju and lock your opponent off of the Brain in 6 Beseiju combo. That would require, I mean, it wouldn't require anything. Beseiju's in hand, it's in the graveyard, it doesn't matter. Pithing Needle will just answer it. An extension to Pithing Needle is Pithing Needle on a Stick, Phyraxian Revoker. So again, enters the battlefield, name an on-land card. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated. So it's a creature, you can potentially enchant it, it can potentially die to removal as well. All right, we got another Tecatli here. We went over him before. Here's some funkier stuff. Burnt Forged Tender. I think I played this more in humans than what I did in Bogles, but it was still in my toolbox for sure. So protection from red, sacrifice it, prevent all damage a red source of your choice would deal this turn. So good against things like Pyroclasm, Anger of the Gods, Sweltering Suns, things like that. Alright, this is a bit more of an obscure one, but it's alright, a little bit of play for me, early days of Pioneer. Another 3 mana hexproof creature. I know 3 mana is not where we want to be, but we had slim pickings at the start of Pioneer. So 3 mana hexproof 3/3 whenever an opponent casts a blue or a black spell during your turn, put a 1/1 counter on Witchstalker. So post board wipe, reloading on a Witchstalker could be very, very dangerous, much like Geist of St. Traft was dangerous as well. Alright, so I did miss a couple of pieces of interaction. Obviously Force of Vigor has been really good. That has that dissynergy with Gadok Teague, which we've talked about many times on my channel, most times when it comes up. But yeah, that's fantastic. Destroy up to 2 target artifacts or enchantments. Really good into Ensnaring Bridge. Other artifacts and enchantment as well. It's really strong into. And although it has that alternate cost of playing it for 0 by exiling a green card from your hand, it's not really card disadvantage to me because you get to answer 2 things. So it's like sort of going even card wise. Pithing Needle we talked about before, but I was just going to say the premium bit of removal we have at the moment is Solitude. I'm a big believer of Solitude. It's another one you can play for 0, and it doesn't give your opponent mana, but it's really nice. It can be pretty strong into Living End as well. You can exile your a creature, and then you've got a life linking 3/2 creature, which is like fairly strong, right? All right. Here we can just like appreciate for a moment. We've got like a playset of Eventide Bogles. I'm not going to pull them all out initially. Unfortunately, I think Core Spirit Dancer has had her day. It's really sad for me to say that, but she was the MVP of this deck, particularly against Control for the longest time. Such a powerful effect, such a sweet card. It has been superseded though by Light Pause in my opinion, especially at like this current point in time. That might not always be the case, but it's the case currently. I got some more of those somewhere. God, I got so many cards around the place, man. I've got non-foils. I've got foils without the imprint. I've got some borderless ones. I wonder if they were there. They're not there. Okay. I have lost track of my cards. I'm so sorry. Obviously, Saram's getting a bit of play in Pioneer, and that's a pretty sweet card, which was, previously more of a Hammer Time card than a Bogle card. All right, so we can see Spirit Mantle. Obviously, it's probably the most premium evasion we've got. It gives protection from creatures, so you can give your creature protection from like a Fury or something, like an Elemental. Opponents can't block it. You can buff up. You can like block for free on your opponent's cards. It's just like all round a pretty strong card. Here's some more wacky cards. So we've got Gluteal Response, sort of like Mana Tithe, counter target blue instant. It's a bit narrow that it only hits blue instants, but Wizards used to respect a color pie, and they just don't anymore. So if this card was made in this day and age, it would probably just counter any instant. But it's sort of wacky because it's not normally in the color pie of green and red, but it's a specific counter target blue instant spell. If it was like instant or sorcery spell or non-creature spell, it would probably be more playable. Flicker Form, an interesting one. This was like pre-Heroic Intervention, sort of like a contender for the slot with like Pithing Needle, but Pithing Needle is way more mana efficient. So 2 mana enchant creature, and then you can hold up the active, remove enchant creature and all auras attached to it from the game, and end of turn return that card to play under its owner's control. If they do, return those auras into play under their owner's control, enchanting that creature. So sort of like Slip Out the Back, but like one that costs you 6 mana to do. So probably Slip Out the Back's a little bit better. Nevermore, just a white card which can like name a specific card in a combo deck. For example, against like Ad Nauseam, you can name Ad Nauseam. But 3 mana, expensive, not super duper viable really. All right. Here's a funky enchantment. I did play this for a little bit in paper. It wasn't the best. This was before Sentinel's Eyes was actually printed, and it gave extra vigilance, which, like having an extra 2 sources of vigilance, having 6 copies in the deck on top of the Daybreak Coronets. It was like semi-viable, but the good thing about this was you could attack through an Ensnaring Bridge sometimes and then buff your creature up instant speed. So your Core Spirit Dancer could be a 2/2. You play Sentinel's Mark. Suddenly it's a 5/5. You might be able to get those last couple of points of damage in, but it wasn't like super reliable again. Eldrazi Conscription is a fun one. So there is a version of the deck that utilizes, I can't even remember what it's called now. There's a blue enchantment with like Aura Swap on it. And I think you play it for 1 mana, you activate it for 2, or maybe it's even activated for 3, but you can Eldrazi Conscription onto your creature, at the beginning of your combat step, get that Annihilator 2 trigger, attacking for 10 trample. Like, it's obscene. It's wacky. It's not consistent. You might get a game from your opponent with that sort of build. There's also the Colossification, which gives plus... Is it plus 20 plus 20 or something? Colossification gives an obscene amount as well. It's just not very consistent. It's a bit of fun if you're looking for something a little bit wacky. We can see Dried Arbor here, our MVP for Edicts for the longest time. You can see a whole heap of foil audacities here. I did pick up a few of them when it was initially printed, not to hoard, but to like use in giveaways, which we've started doing on the channel. A few other pieces. Cartouche of Solidarity, get that 1/1 Knight, play around that hate. We've touched on Cetizen Training earlier on. +1 and Trample, enters the battlefield, draw a card. Targets can only target creatures you control, so maybe against Spellscar. Not really for Modern, maybe for like... I like this bit in Pauper, and it's not too bad in Pauper. It's probably too weak for Pioneer. Griffspoon's kind of good, so you can get past like a Chalice of the Void your opponent has put on 1 or 2. This will go to the graveyard. You can pay 4 mana to return it to the graveyard, and it will like ignore the Chalice, which is pretty sweet. A couple of other random auras. Aqueous Form we played a bit in Bant. Curiosity I never really played, but I kept around, right? It's an extra draw effect. Maybe if someone's playing like Commander, Hex, like Aura Commander, it's something. Alright, here's a bunch of sweet cards from Pauper. We've got the Scattershot Archers for the Fairy matchup. We've got Crimson Acolyte. Protection from red for against those burn decks that run End the Festivities. It doesn't have flying, so it doesn't get hurt by the Scattershot active. The Crimson Acolyte obviously can target other hexproof creatures you control to protect them from sweepers or protect them from blockers. If you're not running the Scattershot Archer, you could consider the Freewind Falcon. This can't come in foil. Crimson Acolyte can. Freewind Falcon cannot come in foil. But Pro Red flying, it's pretty good. There's some non-foil Crimson Acolytes we've got. There's the Crewfix's Insight. I'm so proud of this tech. I think this is fantastic tech for the deck. Alright, have we got anything else of merit here? We've got a bunch of Pioneer cards. There was a time where I played Ledge Walker in a removal heavy meta instead of Core Spirit Dancer, but like that didn't last too long. We got some Ram Through. That card is like creature removal and Pioneer. Our other creature removal, Gut Shot. Pretty sweet stuff. I'm not even playing with Commune with Spirits anymore, but we've got a few toolbox cards here. Spirited Companion, Lifelink I don't play with. We've got that. We've got Young Wolves. I got like a foil Young Wolf I cracked way back in the day when I started playing. During like Innistrad, right? We got our Standard Bearers, which are obviously important tech against white decks, which are also boarding in Standard Bearers, and some more Young Wolves. A few other bits I put aside in like a pile for Pauper was Abundant Growth, Ray of Revelation, Unbrindled Growth, Extra Mana Fixing, Ray of Revelation, Destroy Target Enchantment with Flashback, which I think I played this a little bit back in the day in Modern, but not really that much. It's sort of okay in the mirror match, but now we have Force of Vigor, so there's no reason to play Ray of Revelation. Alright, so we have some Leyline of Sanctities, obviously the staple of the Modern deck for the longest time, and I found the pile of cards that I was losing my mind over before, so we have more Light Paws. Do all of them have the mark? Yeah, all of them have the mark, so I guess I have like 6 of these, because this is a different pile of cards. We also have Fancy Pants Light Paws. These are the non-foils. I've got some foils of them somewhere as well. Host of more Audacities. We've got Generous Visitor for Pioneer. We've got Alpha Authority. These were ones I cracked back in the day as well. I think I ended up finding about 8 of them. It took me like several hours to find these. So if anyone else is having trouble finding Alpha Authority, let me know in the comment section. It could potentially be part of a future giveaway. Alright, so this one's going to wrap up soon. Here we have like I made like several different piles of decks. for Pioneer, but here we have my more completed version, more completed pile. We have an Abundant Growth there that was foil that I did crack back in the day. Utopia Sprawls when I picked up for a couple of bucks when Masters 25 came out. We've got our Lotus Petals. I didn't pick them up too cheap. I think they ended up being about $30 or $40 each, especially with the conversion rate, which hurts a bit. A couple of boring auras in there, but can we just appreciate the beautiful, beautiful artwork of Ancestral Mask and of Armadillo Cloak? Like, I love this old style art. It's such a different like style to the overpacked art of these days, and I get there's a lot going on in this image, but like just such a different style of art. And I guess the cards also like feel a bit different. They feel more delicate. It's just really nice to have pristine cards that are from a long time ago. All right, and here's the last of the cards. Some more like sideboard cards from Pauper. We got some Flaring Pains, some Relics, some Crimson Acolytes in foil again, some more Scattershot Archers, a foil Young Wolf, which I cracked back in the day as well, and just an assortment of random modern cards like some foil Spider Umbras I got a playset of when they came out in Masters set, foil Force of Negation because I really wanted to go deep on this like Bogles deck, biggest believer. Some Stony Silence, some Lavinia, more Gadok Teague, Weather the Storm as well, such a sweet card for against burn, and you know, like Basara Archer Tower, Aqueous 4. So what's the takeaway from this? I own an absolute crap ton of cards, crap ton of Bogle cards. Now that I'm playing it in 3 formats as well, it's only getting worse. Also, I can't keep track of my cards, so I hope you I mean, most of it was like fairly organized. It's a bit hard keeping everything in deck boxes as well when you're in box toppers like this. I want to prevent like curling on a lot of my foils. Sometimes that's like, yeah, you can't really do that if they're in deck boxes as well as you can when they're out. Seal of Cleansing as well. For the longest time, I wanted them to print this, and then when they did, it just wasn't relevant anymore. So against like the Blood Moon decks, I really much prefer searching out like a basic Plains with my Windswept Heath than a basic Forest. But again, Force of Vigor got printed, Blood Moon doesn't see as much play anymore, and like that niche of getting Seal of Cleansing instead of Seal of Primordium isn't really like a niche that matters these days. All right, so that was a heck of a long video, guys. Thank you all very much, especially those of you that made it all the way to the end here. Let me know if you enjoyed this video. It's something that I had in my head for a while there, and I am surprised at how much time it took up. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed a bit of different content from what I normally do. Thank you so much for watching the video, for being on this like journey of the video, getting a bit of an idea of my thoughts and my mindset when problems came up. I'd always look for an answer for those problems, like Matilda's Pride, for example. Like, there's been some absurd, obscene, crazy sideboard cards that I pulled up over the days. Jetted Shackles for Spellsky. There's been some really sweet, crazy tech that's going on. But yeah, we're going to leave that one there, guys. Thanks so much for watching the video. I hope you really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, this video type is not one that I can really do that much in the future, because it's just going to be me going over the same bunch of cards again. Yeah, but for the collectors of you that are out there, those of you that have been with the deck for a long time, I'm sure you're the ones that would appreciate it most. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.